us is Robert Costa, the national political reporter with the Washington Post and co-author of the book Peril with Bob Woodward. Costa Reports is his Twitter handle, by the way, COSTA Reports. And Bob, welcome to the program. This is an absolutely extraordinary deep dive. And before I get into any specific questions about it, you characterize the events of January 6th as a national security emergency that was felt globally. A, you want to expand on that? And B, are there any particular points about this book that you want to make right up front?
The rest of the world is watching what happens on January 6th. Allies and adversaries, China, Iran, North Korea, they're all watching this domestic political crisis and insurrection at the Capitol. And they're wondering, is the United States stable? Is this great democracy in modern history going to have a peaceful transition of power? And this alarm abroad is captured in a phone call between General Lee, the head of the People's Liberation Army in China, and General Mark Milley, the senior military officer of the United States, on January 8th, 2 days after the insurrection, where Lee ponders the question, is the U.S. collapsing? Milley reassures him it is not, and the U.S. is going to hold it together. He says democracy can be sloppy sometimes. But this reporting is revealing of how January 6th was not just about an insurrection in Washington. It was about the spark of instability and chaos that it created across the world.
Well, and you guys, I believe, were the first to reveal that phone conversation. It was wildly mischaracterized in the media as, Milley essentially begging the Chinese not to attack us or exploit this or something like that, when it was kind of the other way around, was it not?
Our book makes it very clear that Milley was working within his duty, within the procedures of his office, to try to make sure that something crazy didn't happen.
Yeah.
He has the Speaker of the House calling him saying Trump's unhinged, and he believes Trump's behavior has deteriorated to the point where, even though he's not a psychiatrist, he has to make a snap judgment that Trump seems to be in serious mental decline in his assessment. So he wants to protect the procedures around nuclear weapons and military strikes.
Would it be accurate to say that there were really two January 6th insurrections? One was the legal effort that I believe your book lays out. John Eastman was the author of this memo that to basically recreate. In fact, back in March of 2020, I wrote an op-ed for Salon that was that laid out what happened in the election of 1876. When Sam Tilden won the majority of the Electoral College votes and won the majority of the national popular vote, but because three southern states and Oregon, three southern states that were occupied by the Union Army, and Oregon, which was occupied at the time by the Ku Klux Klan, submitted two sets of electors to Washington, D.C. They basically didn't hit that 50% threshold with either one of the candidates, and therefore it got thrown to the House of Representatives. There's a whole long story there about how the House, came up with a compromise to stab black people in the back and end Reconstruction, and therefore we ended up with Rutherford Hayes as president, even though he lost the majority vote, the popular vote, and he lost the Electoral College vote. But I was saying this is their game plan, and it turns out it was their game plan, and so really there was a legal coup attempt. That ultimately might have even gone to the Supreme Court for ratification, like in 2000. And there was also, when that failed, when Pence backed out of that, there was also this, okay, let's bring in the riot. What do you think about that?
You are spot on, because right now we have the Department of Justice investigating and prosecuting hundreds of people who were involved with the violence at the Capitol. But there's another element to the insurrection, as you said, and our book details this. It was a legal and political war against Joe Biden from taking office, trying to prevent Biden from becoming president, to throw the election to the House of Representatives. And in John Eastman's memo, 2 pages, 6 parts, which we revealed for the first time, you see the plan. Pence to walk away from the lectern, say Biden doesn't have the necessary 270 electors, bring it to the House where the House Republicans, due to the Constitution, can elect him by delegation vote. And this was the plan, and Trump exerted pressure across the board, not just on Pence, but on DOJ, lawmakers, individual state officials, to try to make this happen. It didn't happen at the end of the day because they didn't have alternate slates of electors. The Electoral Count Act in the late 19th century does provide for a possibility of dueling electors to be presented even after the Electoral College vote. This has only happened once in recent history, in 1960, in early 1961, with Hawaii, say Nixon won, not Kennedy. We haven't seen it since in any real way, a significant way. But this is what they wanted for Republican legislatures across the country, to promote new slates. And the real question for democracy moving forward is, could it happen next time?
Yeah, well, and that's the gist of so many of these laws. It seems to me like the coverage on this, and even the coverage on your book, has been so skewed toward the sensational and the stuff that you can get good B-roll of people beating up cops at the Capitol building with, rather than pointing out that you've got 33 laws that have been passed in 19 states, if my recollection is correct, that many of which assert that no longer is the Electoral College vote going to be determined by how the citizens of this state voted. The Electoral vote that we send to Washington, D.C. is going to be determined by the state legislature, which is entirely Republican controlled. In other words, it seems to me like they're setting up, of the two parts of the January 6th, everyone's sitting around talking about, oh my God, what happens in 2024 if they storm the Capitol again and try to kill, the Speaker of the House again? But the real question is, what happens if in 2024 you get, 10 or 12 states that are sending in, two sets of electors to Washington, D.C., and it gets thrown into the House of Representatives. And the House, 26 Republican states say, yeah, the Republican won, even though the Republican lost in a landslide. And then the Supreme Court says, well, that's what the Constitution says. Dust their hands off and walk away.
And as an author, you don't want to ever complain. But you're right that a lot of the stuff in the book is being missed. One thing that's being missed, to your point, is at the end of the book, James Clyburn, the House Majority Whip, is fuming in the spring of 2021 privately, bringing Manchin to his office, saying, you have to break the filibuster on voting rights. The Republicans are on the march in the states. Law after law is being changed. Republicans and Bannon acolytes are being promoted to election positions in states and municipalities. And at the end, Clyburn confumes, almost in a shout, democracy is on fire, and nothing's being done, in his view, at the federal level, while Republicans are busy every day in all of these states being better positioned for 2022 and 2024.
As a reporter and in a way a historian here, Robert Costa, you did a deep dive into this, but I know you're familiar with the larger picture of American history. Have we? I don't recall in my lifetime, certainly. Obviously you've got the precedent of the Civil War, but have we ever had a time when one of the major political, outside of the Civil War, when one of the major political parties basically said, we just don't believe in democracy anymore. We are going to use the rule of law, as it were. We're going to use the structural weaknesses of the system. We're going to use the loopholes we can find to gain and hold power in defiance of the majority of Americans.
You have a Republican Party that this week is revealing itself as still very much in the thrall of Trump. McConnell can't stand Trump. We report in the book, he calls him a fading brand, an off-the-track thoroughbred. Yet what did McConnell do this week? He endorsed Herschel Walker in the Georgia Republican Senate primary race. That's the Trump favorite. He knows as much as anyone that Herschel Walker is very Trumpy, very close to Trump, has said some incendiary things in the past. But McConnell, like so many others, are pulled along in the riptide and make the decision to stay in that riptide with Trump for a variety of reasons we could get into. But this is a party that is not in any way tempering what's happening in the states when it comes to voting rights. If at all, they're looking away or actively stoking the effort.
Yeah, you have more than 200 interviews that you and Bob Woodward conducted that became the skeleton of this book. And some of them are absolutely fascinating. Paul Ryan, you would think, represents the old Republican Party, or kind of the Bob Dole Republican Party, arguably, maybe. Tell us about his conversations with Donald Trump.
Ryan is part of the old guard, even though he's kind of a younger guy. And when he comes in, he wants to try to get who this person is, because he and Trump had clashed during the Access Hollywood episode in October of 2016. And so Ryan's searching for answers. How do you understand a total outsider, celebrity real estate guy who seems to be just out of control in his personality, and a wealthy New York donor and doctor sends to Ryan psychiatry manuals, real psychiatry handbooks about narcissism personality disorder. And Ryan studies them meticulously based on our reporting, trying to get a grasp of Trump. And he learns from these articles that you can't embarrass someone with that disorder publicly. You can't humiliate them or else they really lash out. And he tries to kind of come up with a way of containing Trump based on his informal diagnosis. He's not a psychiatrist, that Trump has narcissistic personality disorder. But as our book shows, even Ryan's approach, his ginger approach in handling Trump in some respects and confronting him at others, just doesn't work. He ultimately leaves Congress and never really figures out Trump.
Did in your opinion, did he leave Congress because of Trump?
It's certainly part of it.
Tell us about Bill Barr's pleas to Donald Trump. It was kind of piggybacking on Paul Ryan. I mean, it was another attempt by a semi-rational Republican, although, full-blown toady here. Well, let me just toss it to you.
Bill Barr is someone who is a political ally of Trump. He's trying to help Trump out, to do what Trump wants. But even Barr at the end is pushed to the brink, and he can't really get Trump to contain himself or to move in a more just even-tempered direction. He has a confrontation with Trump in April of 2020, and he says to Trump in a private meeting, "You are an effing A, and you got to stop being that. Voters think you're one, and you think you are an effing genius." And Barr's message is Trump is so egotistical at that moment in the campaign, so self-confident that he can overwhelm any problem, any crisis with his personality and his support among Republican base voters. Barr warns him, you're going to lose. You're going to lose. You really risk losing if you keep approaching everything in this bombastic, swaggering way instead of trying to talk up a more sensible approach in the pandemic and other fronts. But the Barr story in Peril is like so many other Republican stories in Peril. People have their opinions, but ultimately Trump does what he wants, doesn't really listen, is all about protecting Trump, staying in power.
How, I realize you don't get into this in the book, but I'm curious your thoughts of parallels between Trump and other historical figures who rose up within democratic societies, took them over, and ultimately devastated them over the short term. I'm thinking Mussolini, Franco, obviously Hitler, but that comparison is sometimes considered over the top. Pinochet. Do you see parallels?
As a reporter, you see someone who, at the end of the day, becomes very comfortable with power. Mm-hmm. I've covered Trump for 10 years. I've interviewed him for a long time. And when he came into the presidency in 2017, it was advisors like Gary Cohn, his economic advisor, stealing documents off of his desk. That was the opening scene of Woodward's first book, mm-hmm. Fear, on Trump. And you see Trump in the beginning, this outsider who Paul Ryan and so many others thinking they can kind of nudge in a certain direction to guide along. But by the end, and you can make the historical comparison, I won't, you see someone who is fully consumed with the presidency, wanting to stay in it, and knows the buttons to push in a way he did not in 2017. And that really tested American democracy in those final days.
From your reporting, Robert, and we have 30 seconds to another break here. Do you think that was primarily motivated by his just love of power, or was how much of that motivation was that being president kept him from being prosecuted as his past was coming visible?
I can't read his mind, but I hesitate to just attribute things to ego or branding or narcissism. As a reporter, you got to follow what people do. And Trump pushed everybody around. The DOJ, state officials, Pence. He was calling into the Willard War Room on January 5th on the eve of the insurrection.
Robert, we had Defense Secretary Mark Esper. You cite his thoughts about the Insurrection Act. Can you tell our listeners, what is the Insurrection Act and what was this conflict that Esper was weighing in on?
Esper is confirmed by the Senate. He's Secretary of Defense in the summer, and he's trying to prevent Trump from bringing the 82nd Airborne into Washington, D.C. They're stationed. This is the most lethal force in the military over at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. Trump's saying to Esper, to Milley, bring them in. Have them confront the racial justice protesters in Washington, D.C. Let's make this happen. Let's do it. And they're pushing back on Trump, saying, we can't do it. You bring them in, it's going to be worse than 1968 with LBJ and the riots. This is going to be a lethal fighting force against unarmed protesters. It's just a disaster for the country. It's going to be bloody. But Trump wants the confrontation. Ultimately, it doesn't happen. But you see Esper 5 days after the election, on November 9th, 2020, and that's when Gina Haspel, the CIA director, confides privately after Esper's fired. If Esper's gone, who's one of the bulwarks against Trump from really doing stuff like calling in the 82nd Airborne, what else is possible? What's going to happen? And she worries privately that the U.S. could be on the brink of a right-wing coup.
This is the one thing that I keep getting throughout your book is how close we came. How would you describe that, and how diminished or amplified is that peril right now?
The peril stretches across the national security front with China. We have all these scenes in our book with China, but the China story continues with its hypersonic weapon. Milley and others are watching that very closely. What is China doing, flexing its muscle like this? Does it have to do with a possible action against Taiwan? The U.S. is on edge, so are our U.S. allies abroad about China. It's not only an economic superpower now, but it's a military one, and it has a lot of different dynamics in the South China Sea. It's a hair-triggered environment that you have to watch every day, every second, if you're at the highest ranks of the U.S. military. So that peril certainly remains. And on the domestic front, the January 6th committee trying to get answers and accountability for an insurrection is stymied at almost every front. There's no John Dean yet stepping forward and saying, I was inside and there were criminal acts. There's just a lot of hedging. There's a lot of people blocking documents. Trump has sued the National Archives to block documents and asserted executive privilege. So on the foreign front, we've just discussed it, but on the domestic front, so many unanswered questions about an insurrection that rattled American democracy, and that's certainly perilous.
Yeah, you write about Kevin McCarthy. My sense of Kevin McCarthy has always been that he's way out of his league, that he's I don't mean to sound snarky, but, not the brightest bulb on the tree. Tell us about your reporting on Kevin McCarthy.
He is someone who comes in to the House leadership after the 2010 midterms, and he's been there now for about a decade. He's a survivor. Paul Ryan goes away. Eric Cantor goes away. McCarthy is kind of there in the post-Ryan era to be the House leader, and he sees Trump as someone who can help House Republicans. Unlike Ryan, who's uncomfortable with Trump, McCarthy is friendly with him. And I wrote a story once about how McCarthy ingratiates himself so much with Trump that he provided the president at the time with Starburst candies of his favorite flavors of Starburst in a jar just to make sure Trump knew he was on his side.
Yeah.
But McCarthy at the end is saying to Trump, you got to call Biden, you got to have a peaceful transition. But Trump doesn't listen to McCarthy at the end. But yet still, it's McCarthy looking ahead to 2022, believing Trump could be helpful.
Right, and he apparently still is. We have about 45 seconds here, Robert. How do the Republicans deal with this going forward?
There's a question of who's in power, who's in control. Is someone going to step up and counter Trump or not? I don't see it at this time.
Yeah, this is grim stuff. You also mentioned Rudy Giuliani's advice to Trump. You want to give us the top line on that?
Giuliani's advice was just to fight on and to declare the election stolen. And that was the plan from November 4th and 5th through the end of the presidency. Never concede, never surrender, declare it all rigged, fight it in the courts, and then when you fail in the courts, fight it on the vice presidential front. When he doesn't do it, speak out in his name, pressure lawmakers, push it to the edge.
They're still doing it too, aren't they?